Today we're going to do an author bio on C.S. Lewis. He is one of my favorite authors, and in my opinion, one of the greatest authors that ever lived. The reason that I think that is because he wrote in so many different genres effectively. Probably his science fiction novels have been the least popular of all his writings, but he did essays, lectures, allegory, novel, children's novel, and more, and did these all effectively. He has something for everyone. And if you read much at all, you'll interact with C.S. Lewis at some point. Some people's favorites, I really like The Great Divorce. I also really like Screwtape Letters, but I love Weight of Glory. And Abolition of Man is incredibly deep and meaningful. Of course, Mere Christianity is a fascinating book. So he has a lot to offer. There's a lot for everybody. He was born in 1898, November 29th in Belfast. It was just him and one brother that grew up together and had a happy home. His dad was aloof and detached all his life, and Lewis references attempts that he made to draw close to his father and that it never really worked. He makes a comment in Surprised by Joy about how his father could never quiet his mind long enough to really hear him, that he didn't know how to listen. He was a good man, but probably somewhat weaker than Lewis's mother. Lewis's mother was a more devout Christian, and he was raised that way. He has his older brother he called Warnie, and they were good friends when they were young. And when Lewis was about 9, I think it was, his mother became very ill and then died. It was the first great tragedy of his life, and it changed everything. It wasn't just that mother was gone and that ached. It began his exit out of Christianity and away from God. That event brought that on partially because he prayed so hard for her to live and felt that if he prayed hard enough that she should live, and then she didn't. And so he was heartbroken by that and began to question God just a little bit. His father had a complete breakdown and couldn't handle the death at all. And so he sent both boys to a boarding school, and the first boarding school they went to was horrific. Lewis had nothing but horrible things to say about it, that the food was horrible, the education was horrible, they were deprived of heat and decent food, some of the children were whipped. This is early turn of the century in England, but it was the kind of thing that was still going on, and that Dickens in the 19th century had complained about in many of his writings and had had similar experiences. So he had this horrible experience and begged to come home. He was finally able to go to a different boarding school and had a much better experience there. When he went to college, his march toward atheism really increased. He had a woman who was like a caretaker over him, and she made comments and did things that he, looking back, realized were not meant to be detrimental or harmful, but actually ended up being spiritually harmful to him. He really submersed himself in intellectualism. It was fashionable to be atheistic. There were seemingly good, well-reasoned arguments for it, and so he became an atheist. And his comment about leaving a God-fearing life was that he felt relieved, and while deciding that God didn't exist, he was angry at God for not existing. And so it was this great dichotomy in his life. It was something that was always in the back of his mind, and took many more years to work out. Probably the greatest story about him is his experience of coming back to God and the path that brought him there. He was involved in World War I and went with a best friend, a good friend, and they both left family behind. And they promised each other that if one or the other of them died in the war, that they would take care of the other person's family. not necessarily completely financially, but they would be there for them and make sure that they were okay. Well, Lewis's friend died in the war, and of course Lewis survived, and so this young man had a sister and a mother who needed help, who needed caretaking, and so Lewis, in fact, I think, took care of them financially for a period of time, boarding with them, paying the bills, and was lifelong friends with them, and was good to his word. The war really shook him up, intensified this atheism he was moving toward, and he moved on with his career. He was an academic. He knew he was an intellectual. He loved to study and read. He loved to exercise his mind. He was absolutely brilliant. I can't remember if it was, it seems like it was probably, I didn't review all of these details before I did this. This is just mostly off of memory. But I can't remember if it was before the war or after that he was sent to a private tutor. They called him the Old Knock. And it seems like maybe it was before, I'm not sure. And this man was also brilliant and also atheistic, and contributed to that mindset for Lewis. The thing that brought him back to God, and a few of the quotes that I'll give you now are from a book called Surprised by Joy. We're going to post this book with the autobiographies in the book reviews, this author review in the book reviews, so that you can know and make note that Surprised by Joy is the best work for coming to know the way Lewis thought as it's autobiographical. It says, the shape of my early life. And the central message is his movement out of Christianity and away from God and then back to belief in God. And he starts it out talking about this concept of joy that made a huge impression on him as a young man, as a boy actually, and it was the key element. This idea of joy was the key thing that brought him back to God. And so it's important to understand a little bit about what he means. Here's an example of him trying to explain joy. The very first is itself the memory of a memory, the very first indication of joy that he's going to explain. As I stood beside a flowering currant bush on a summer day, there suddenly arose in me, without warning, as if from a depth not of years but of centuries, the memory of that earlier morning at the old house when my brother had brought his toy garden into the nursery. So he had had this kind of similar experience with joy. The first one he remembers is when his brother brought this little toy garden he had created in a box, brought it into the nursery. This happened again. It's difficult to find words strong enough for the sensation which came over me. Milton's enormous bliss of Eden, giving the full ancient meaning to enormous, comes somewhere near it. It was a sensation, of course, of desire. But desire for what? Not certainly for a biscuit tin filled with the moss, nor even, though that came into it, for my past. And before I knew what I desired, the desire itself was gone. The whole glimpse withdrawn, the world turned commonplace again, or only stirred by a longing for the longing that had just ceased. It had taken only a moment of time, and in a certain sense, everything else that had ever happened to me was insignificant in comparison. He talks about reading other books. When Squirrel Nutkin talks about autumn, when he was reading the Longfellow's Saga of King Olaf, he says, I was uplifted into huge regions of northern sky I desired with almost sickening intensity. And then he says this, I found myself at the very same moment already falling out of the desire and wishing I were back into it. So he has these glimpses. Throughout his childhood, there's very few. These moments of intense desire and longing, and I know what he means because I've experienced it. It's the moment that brings tears to my eyes when it's a happiness, but it's a longing. It's a sad happiness that's a confirmation of something and a witness of something. And so this is his experience. And he says that he would always wish that he could be back in that moment. And then he says, the reader who finds these 3 episodes of no interest need read this book no further, for in a sense the central story of my life is about nothing else. That's how he felt about this concept of joy. He goes on to give beautiful explanations for what that joy was, how it visited him again several times in adult life, and how it became to be something. There were intellectual arguments made. For those that aren't aware, he had a book group, a book club, a book group that was called the Inklings, and they read and discussed books, and they also wrote books and discussed the books that they were writing. J.R.R. Tolkien was a close friend of his and contributed. Barfield also was a close friend in that Inklings group, and they both contributed to Lewis's Reconversion. One of the comments that, and I can't remember where I've read this now, but one of the things that Lewis said contributed to his experience of coming back to Christianity and to God was the idea that Tolkien shared of him. Lewis loved folk stories. He'd read folk stories from virtually every civilization. Norse folklore was some of his very favorite. And in all of these ancient cultures that he read about, there was often a story of a god that came and sacrificed himself for humanity. Well, one of the comments that Tolkien made that made a difference on Lewis was when Tolkien said, think of all of this study that you've done over all these years and this common story. He said, what if those were all knockoffs? What if those were in all of these ancient cultures because they were memories or reflections or prophecies of the one real time it ever really happened, that a god did come down and sacrifice himself. So that made a difference in Lewis's experiences. He loved MacDonald. Loved George MacDonald, had a big influence on him, but also, oh man, I'm trying to remember his name, and I can't find it right here. He said he thought he was the most reasonable man to ever live. And his reason and the concept of joy were the things that brought him back to God. He had an experience where it's Chesterton. Chesterton's Everlasting Man had a huge impact on him. George MacDonald as well. There was a moment when he felt God closing in on me. He said that more than anything else, he felt God pursuing him, almost chasing him, like a cat and mouse game. He felt God closing in on him, is how he says it. And that at one moment he felt I was in fact offered what now appears a moment of wholly free choice. He felt that there was this moment when there were enough arguments that had brought him close enough to the ability to intellectually be able to begin to accept the idea of God, and that he had the choice whether or not he was going to open his heart to that possibility. He says it was probably the most free choice he ever made in his life, and it made the difference for everything else. We talk about that at the Ten Boom Institute, about being willing, and that's a big element of a willingness to accept God. He said that this choice to continue to pursue the idea that there might be a God led him, for the first time, he said, I examined myself with a seriously practical purpose, and there I found what appalled me. A zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. My name was Legion. So he finally accepted that there might be a God, did a self-analyzation and found himself lacking and needing to change, and that was what really opened the door. That he began to see that God wanted all of him, completely and totally, and that he must accept, it must be a complete surrender to God. Then he says, in the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. One last thing I want to say about C.S. Lewis. A man came and helped him in the end of his life when he was very ill, and he spent time with Lewis and loved him a lot, and he made a comment. He said, I just knew that no matter how long I lived, no matter who else I met, I should never be in the company of such a supremely good human being again. He was, above everything else, true to what he taught. He was a man of true integrity and courage, the courage to see and accept God.